Welcome, friends and partners. Thank you for joining the Democratic Volunteer Center, or DVC as we say, and our co-sponsors today for this excellent program featuring former Ohio State Party Chair, law professor, and acclaimed author, David Pepper. His motto is, "We won't quit." David is a dynamic and passionate speaker, so you are in for a real treat. But before I continue, let me say that we are in this fight for our democracy together. And we will prevail because we will join all forces and work together to achieve victories in 2022. We all know that this is not an easy road to victory, but we know that we must prevail for generations to come. We perform best when we work together and collaborate. The DVC brings volunteers together and provides a platform for engagement in the democratic process. As you can see, we have been doing since our founding in 2010. Our mission is to elect Democrats at the local, state, and national levels. And we do this by providing the infrastructure, expertise, and support to enable activists the opportunity to work with campaigns, engage voters, and learn the various ways they can help to ensure democratic victories. We will continue to build on the skills we adapted to during the pandemic separation, but we do plan to have a physical space this year. Most likely, it'll be a hybrid model of virtual and in-person actions. There's nothing like coming together safely in a community space to create energy and enthusiasm. We need to support each other as we protect our democracy, which, as you know, is being seriously challenged. The DVC needs your financial support for our 2022 campaign office. If you were able to donate, we sincerely appreciate your support and look forward to working together to secure democratic victories in 2022. I would like to take a moment to give a special shout out to the Dvc Events Committee, who has brought this outstanding Defending Democracy series to you. And of course, all of our committees and volunteers who work tirelessly to organize engagement opportunities. The DVC is very fortunate to have the support of local representatives like Anna Eshu and Ro Khanna, who opened many doors for our programs and engagement. Now, it is indeed my honor to introduce California's Attorney General, Rob Bonta. Rob exemplifies the dedication to state action that you will hear from David Pepper. He served as Deputy City Attorney for San Francisco from 2003 to 2012, on the Alameda City Council from 2010 to 2012, and then the California State Assembly from 2012 to 2021. Rob has always worked against injustice and to promote positive change in civil rights, immigration, healthcare, housing, and prison reform. April 23rd last year, 2021, Rob Bonta was sworn in as the 34th Attorney General for California. And on January 30th, 2022, he came to talk to us gathered here. Welcome, Attorney General Bonta.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Pam, and good afternoon, everyone. Honored to be with you here today, and thank you to the Democratic Volunteer Corps for hosting such an important forum today with such a distinguished leader, who I'll tell you a bit about in my introduction. Many of you may know I am Attorney General Rob Bonta. I'm thrilled to be here to introduce someone who's a champion of our democracy, and he's a former college and law school classmate of mine. So offline, you can ask me for any good stories I can share about David Pepper. Democracy, as you know, is powerful. It is sacred, and it is also something we can't simply take for granted. Trump's big lie affirmed that, but democracy's fragility is something I know you've long known about, and I've known about before the days leading up to January 6th. From my own perspective about the fragility of democracy, I'm the son of an immigrant mother from the Philippines, and we left my birth country the Philippines because when a dictator came to power, we lost our freedoms. He invoked martial law. He stripped away civil rights. He revoked the right to vote in free and in fair elections. And Trump's big lie brought the rule of law to the brink in the United States, but thankfully he did not succeed as Ferdinand Marcos did in the Philippines. What Trump and his cronies organized was a new extreme, but it was also part of a coordinated attack on our democracy that we've seen Republicans organize for years. Red states across the country have passed laws that create new barriers to voting and make it easier to overturn election results. These actions are, we know, a threat to the integrity of our federal elections and a threat to everything that America stands for. So whether it's ongoing voter suppression or Trump's attempted coup, when the forces of tyranny and oppression subvert our laws and our rights, we must ensure accountability. Democracy demands that we all take action. This is an active participatory sport. You all know that. If we're not on the field, we will lose. It's not a spectator sport. We got to get in the game. And today we'll hear from David about the fight for democracy taking place across our states and our state houses right now in real time. David is the former chair of the Ohio Democratic Party, the author of The Voter File, The People's House, The Wingman, and the center of today's discussion, Laboratories of Autocracy, a wake-up call from behind the lines. He's a recently former elected official in Ohio who served with distinction in many critical roles, a former federal law clerk on the United States Court of Appeals, a law professor, an author, and again, most personally to me, a friend who I had the honor and pleasure of going to college with and going to law school with. Way back in 1989, if you could believe it, we would traipse up the same set of stairs regularly to visit the same quad of friends that we had. That was when I had the honor of meeting David for the first time. So please, I know you're all in for a huge treat. It's my honor to introduce him. Please welcome my friend and the man of the hour, the amazing David Pepper.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob. Attorney General Bonta, it's great to be with you. It's great to see you. We go way back, as you said. It's an honor, and I'm so excited. For those of you who don't know, Rob, shown everywhere he's ever been. So those of us who've known him a long time are not at all surprised by how far he's rising, and I think we'll continue to. And just to truly, if you were looking for someone you'd want to be in public service, Rob Bonta is as good as it gets. So thank you. And thank you to Elise also for all she's doing in the California State House as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We are going to present something. I know this is your typical format. Present something through a PowerPoint and then get to a Q&A. And I'm very excited to present this to you. Some of you may have read the book. My hope is others will be inspired to read it. But we are at a moment of crisis, our democracy, in a way we haven't seen in generations. And so I'm honored by your audience today on a day that I know is busy with many other things going on. So let me just start by posing this hypothetical. What if a country somewhere in the world that we observed had rigged legislative elections so that 99% of results were guaranteed and a minority retained power, whatever the voters did, or if that country attacked the independent operations of elections and vote counting to make sure they had control over the outcomes, or attacked specifically the voters of the opposition party to make it more difficult for those voters to vote, along with those attacked protesters aligned with that opposition party, attacked the independent courts that provide a check and balance on that government, ignored or violated the elected will of their own electorate expressed through referenda, violated their own constitutions repeatedly, changed laws to protect themselves from being held accountable for corruption, and even cleansed history of elements that cast a bad light on the party in control and its policies. Some might say, oh, he's talking about Hungary or Putin or Russia. And the answer is, yeah, they are doing all those things. But I'm here to tell you everything I just described is also happening here in this country, in state house after state house after state house. The series of things that would trigger our alarm in other countries, that do trigger those alarms, that make us act and make us concerned and allow us to say that country is falling from democracy. All those elements and then some are happening at this moment in state houses around the country. And that kicks off the overall point of my book in today's presentation, is that we are seeing a crisis in American democracy. And before you simply think it's about January 6th or Donald Trump or Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert. I'm here to tell you to paraphrase the old Bill Clinton line about the economy. It's about the state houses. That's where it's happening. And I want to walk through why that's happening, the acceleration of it, and then go to what we have to do about it before we take questions. So to really quickly, I'm going to go pretty quickly here because I want to have time for questions. The problem starts with state houses that if you look at them closely, in a world where we have many levels of government, they sort of present what I call, and I do it not without, some hesitation because it's a pretty damning statement, but in the wrong hands, especially state houses have all the makings of being the Achilles heel of American governance. Now, why is that? The next slide begins to walk through that. So they do have great powers, and this is something that's often overlooked. State houses can affect our economy in enormous ways. They can affect healthcare. They can affect education, issues like the climate. Almost every social issue we care about is something in a state house can impact. But state houses also have a role that often is overlooked. Again, all of this is overlooked, unfortunately, by most people. But this power is especially overlooked, although it goes all the way back to the founding. State houses also have enormous influence over democracy itself. It goes back to the Constitution. They have a major say in the rules of elections, state and federal, and that ends up meaning they can impact who also gets to vote and how easily people get to vote. They draw the district lines for themselves and for Congress. They also have an influence, major one, as Donald Trump learned too late, but it's true, over the selection of presidential electors that lead to the presidency of the United States. These state houses also, and it varies a little bit, but for the most part, they have a huge amount of power over federal policies and how those policies impact states. They have more power than people would ever believe in a lot of these states over statewide officials. They have leverage over governors and secretary of state and others, and they can wield that when they want to. In a lot of states like Ohio and many others, they also can sort of supersede local control, and I'll talk through it. They do it all the time when certain people want them to. So on this slide, I put together this sort of toxic problem that this is why they're the Achilles heel. They may have great power, but they have great anonymity. Most people could not name your state house members. Their elections are quite low profile. The media in most of these states is dwindling quickly, so people don't know who these people are or what they do. Many of them are far away in state capitals. Many of them have very short sessions, a few months out of the year, and then these people return to their day jobs back home in a small town somewhere, as the local lawyer or funeral home director or something else. That is what leads to this toxic combination. They have great powers over democracy, but also all these other interests. Most people back home don't know it, but insiders, both in state and growing nationally, know exactly what these folks can do and are surrounding them more and more, because if these state houses do certain things along the lines they want, they do very well. And that includes, financial interest policy, the Koch brothers, payday lenders, for-profit charter school operators, social policy, attacks on Roe v. Wade, crazy gun laws that make us all less safe, and ultimately also democracy itself. So a lot of power, a lot of anonymity. Too few people know about it, but the powers that be know about it. Throw into that gerrymandering. Everything I just described got worse in the last 10 years because of the heightened extreme gerrymandering that we are seeing in this country. The 2011 cycle in particular was where we went from a place that, of course, we've had gerrymandering always, but it's gotten worse and worse. In 2011, in Ohio and many other states, it really became gerrymandering on steroids. Let me walk you through a couple examples. Ohio, if you read my book, you'll see it's a lot like What's the Matter with Kansas, but it focuses a lot on Ohio and other states, and it's about democracy itself. So Ohio is a little bit of the canary in the coal mine as a former blue state. And Ohio's gerrymandering tells the story as well as any state. So here is an apples to apples comparison of the districts in states like Ohio, but others, before and after the 2010 election and 11 election rigging. And the reason 8 and 12 are so helpful is because Obama won all these states in both years, and he won them by almost the exact same amount in both years, slightly less, but basically the same blue Ohio, blue Michigan, other states. The 2008 Congress had 10 Democratic folks from Ohio, 8 Republicans. Only 4 years later, that same blue Ohio generated 12 Republicans and 4 Democrats. That's how extreme the gerrymandering was. It converted 10-8 to 4-12. Same story in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Majority Democratic delegations on a blue map. Same blue map in 2012 became super minority delegations the other way. Go to the state house on the right side of this thing. Same story. Democrats controlled, in some cases by significant numbers, the state houses of these states when their states were blue in 2008. 2012 comes around, flips to majority or supermajority the other side. That's just the first level of how extreme the gerrymandering is. The next slide walks you through. It's even worse than that initial flip from red to blue. This shows you that essentially what this gerrymandering has led to. And I present this slide so that folks sort of come to grips with what we're dealing with. As the top of this slide, well, I say in a second, but basically these districts are so gerrymandered that not only do they, in the state house, for example, give themselves 62 seats out of 99, they basically almost not a single Republican in Ohio and these other states actually faces a real election their entire career. That sounds dramatic, but it's true. This is the average margin of victory over 10 years in these districts. 17 of the 62 seats, 50% margin of victory or more. Next 21 seats, 65-35 or better. Next 12, that's 50 total seats that are 20% or more better. The next 12 seats are 10% or more better. You're essentially looking at a generation of elected officials in states like Ohio that have come to power and stayed in power without ever being connected to democracy, without ever having real elections. So when you keep looking at them wondering, why are they so extreme? That's why. These are not folks who've risen in the way that Rob Bonta has or the way that I had to, where you actually go out and face voters. Their seats have been rigged for them from the moment their career started, and that's all they've ever known. And that leads to a whole lot of problems, which I'll talk about in a second. Next slide shows just how effective the gerrymandering is even more than I could describe before. 2018, this is the 2018 year. This was a blue wave year, very big wave. And even in 2018, in a blue wave, they kept control of these state houses so dramatically that in each of these 3 states, Ohio was about 50-50, but Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the majority of the voters of these states voted for Democrats for their state house in each one. In Wisconsin, on the right, for example, voted by 9% for a Democrat for their state house, an overwhelming margin. In each of these states, the state house delegations remained in Republican hands. That's how effective their gerrymandering is. That's how Orban leads Hungary. He gerrymanders districts so much that even when the majority of the people want the other people in charge, they're still in charge. All of this, as I said, is basically a generation of people who haven't been in real democracy. And it's also created really warped incentives. When you don't have democracy, it turns out, and I think this is true far more than even those who gerrymandered all this back a few years ago would have anticipated. The incentives that come with this lack of democracy are really warped. And I'll just go through them quickly. And again, this is all in the book. And in this presentation, I put the chapters below of where in the book I show this through data. The one incentive that we all assume that Rob Bonta or others are trying to serve when they're in office disappears. If no one back home knows who you are, and they don't have a choice in the election, all of a sudden the public outcomes that you are trying to hit, they don't really matter anymore. And the reason we're seeing a decline in public outcomes in state after state that are run in these undemocratic ways is because these politicians aren't held accountable to those outcomes. They simply don't matter. What does matter? Keeping the private interests that are right in the face of these people happy. That's why in Ohio, we've had 15 years, almost 20, of for-profit charter school online scams. that have not educated almost anyone in a good way, have pulled tons of money out of our public schools. Our public schools in Ohio fell from 5th to 26th, but the politicians keep getting reelected. Why? They're serving the private interests that give them all the money they need. And the people back home don't understand that the reason their schools are falling apart and are underfunded is because the state house is doing it up in Columbus. So you have public outcomes no longer mattering, private interests mattering a ton. A couple other key ones. This is, again, I can only go through this for so long, but lack of popular support no longer matters. Item after item they push, attacking Roe v. Wade. That's unpopular in almost every state, not just California. Ohioans support Roe v. Wade. Texans support Roe v. Wade. But in these gerrymandered state houses, it doesn't hurt you to attack popular items. Same with guns. People want things done on climate change. None of it matters when you're in these rigged state houses. As I say, in a way, on the fourth number here, you actually have not only you don't have an incentive to do popular things, you have a powerful incentive to do unpopular things, not just because the private people tell you to, because it's the best way to do well in your next primary. Your primary opponent can't outflank you. There's same reason there's no incentive to work across party lines. If you do, you'll lose the next primary. Believe it or not, there's little incentive to combat corruption. But then and then there's a powerful incentive, as I say, to be as extreme as possible, because that way you will not lose your next primary. This all sounds bad, right? The Achilles heel of American governments, a direct control over politics and democracy, people locked into power no matter what they do. I'm about to make it, before I get to the sort of positive side, I'm about to make it a little worse for you. If this is the first time that a lot of people are thinking of this, the bad news is the other side figured out this Achilles heel a generation ago. They figured it out and they harnessed it to do what they've wanted. And they've been doing it for decades. And the reason everything seems to be accelerating right now in these state houses is because this is not because of the big lie. It's not because Donald Trump. It's because groups like ALEC and the Koch brothers and NRA, learning from them, and other major interests actually figured out that these state houses were the perfect place to get their agendas done. And they've been working on that for decades. And it especially took off after that 2011 year I talked about. With these state houses, they have managed to do all of these things and others. Again, what's the commonality here? Unpopular things that help those private interests, things that help the donors, things that would never get done in a real democracy because they're so unpopular. These people would lose office, but in state houses, they can do it and get away with them. The title of the book is Laboratories of Autocracy, and there's a reason I put in the word laboratories, not just because it's playing off that old phrase from Justice Brandeis, laboratories of democracy. These state houses have become laboratories, meaning they're always trying new things. They're always learning from the things they do. And so the last decade or plus of all of this activity from ALEC and the Koch brothers in all these state houses has led to critical lessons that these state houses and those who support them have learned in all this time. A couple things, and they're a little repetitive before, but I want to restate them. They have learned the popularity of an issue does not matter. In fact, if an issue is unpopular that you want to have done, if you are the Koch brothers or you are the NRA, you have learned that the way you get it done is through state houses. City councils in most places would never do it. Congress would never do it. These things are too unpopular. The way you do it is through state houses because you realize they will never lose their office because of what I've described. The next one is they do care about secrecy. Because as they learned on a few occasions, when the word gets out that something unpopular happens, and the donors in particular are identified, those donors get cold feet. So they do want to be secretive, even though the popular doesn't matter. They have learned, as I said in the prior slide, legislators end up being more powerful than governors in many of these states. They can overwhelm more centrist governors or Democratic governors wielding the powers they have. Number 4 and 5 go together. The number 4 is, I call it the 80-20 rule in the book. They they win by throwing forward so much legislation, so much crazy stuff in a world where there are only so many reporters or so many advocate groups, that even if 80% of what they want to get done doesn't get done, as long as they throw it all forward and 20% of it gets done, they're happy. Because since they're doing it all around the country, 20% here, 20%, 20% somewhere else, over a multiple year process, which they have, they end up winning everywhere all the time. So you'll see in a lot of states, they throw a ton of churn at these state houses. Some of the most controversial issues explode and get controversial and get headlines, and sometimes they disappear. But when you're not looking, a bunch of other things got passed that no one ever saw because they were focused on the one. That has worked incredibly well for them. And when you look at number 5, if that is happening on a repeat basis, it gives every state the ability to take whatever's passed through number 4 and model their new laws after things they can point to that were passed somewhere else. And the last and potentially most, decisive lesson that they have learned through this is number 6. And this is pretty sobering. They have learned that the politicians in these state houses that they help actually don't matter in the end to them. They have learned that the key is the incentives, the warped incentives I went through earlier, that these politicians all respond to the incentives in the same way. So if someone is term limited or gets kicked out in a scandal or something else, the next politician steps in and does exactly what that prior politician did. We've seen that in Ohio. You've seen it in other places. These state houses are now rife with corruption. Sometimes they get kicked out for those reasons, but it hasn't mattered. It just keeps going, and everyone who gets into these positions keeps doing the same thing. So that leads to the conclusion, and the bottom line of this slide, what matters more than the individual politicians is the effort to keep democracy as sort of at bay as possible, keep those warped incentives as strong as possible, and everything just keeps going. And that takes me to my next slide. So part and parcel with these state houses and all they're doing has been the nonstop attack on democracy itself. And that's key because it means that the results I described earlier just keep going. It doesn't change no matter who the politicians are. And we've seen this escalate over the last decade. It started, in the recent history. Obviously, we've had a history of this our whole nation's history. But the backlash to Obama winning was where we really started seeing this. And one of the important points here is they weren't just mad that Obama won the presidency. In states like Ohio and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, they were mad that when Obama won, his coalition cost them their power in those states. And that's a very important lesson. This isn't only about the presidency. The Ohio Republicans were mad that when Ohio went blue in 2008, we won the Ohio State House. Same within Michigan, same within Wisconsin. So they immediately, as they always do, went to work figuring out with the powers they have our democracy, how could they destroy the coalition that had defeated them at all levels in 2008? And that's when they began targeting the rising American electorate that was the Obama coalition. They attacked the way that electorate voted, vote by mail, early vote. In states like Ohio, they purged voters brutally. They attacked organized labor because they saw that as a major funder of the campaigns that they weren't winning. Over the course of the decade, though, it got more direct. In 2016, when Democrats, it worked very well for them in 2014 and in 2010, but in 2016, they started to lose some of the statewide offices that they had held on to, like North Carolina. In 2018, they lost other offices like Michigan, Wisconsin. And that's when we saw them escalate from just attacking the voters to actually attacking the outcomes of elections. They began to strip power away from winning governors. They did that in North Carolina nonstop, in Michigan and Wisconsin. They also started doing other measures like attacking citizen-led initiatives. They just simply ignored the results. And that's when alarm bells should have gone off. Again, long before, the big lie, these people began to attack the results of elections directly, even when they knew that they only represented a minority of the voters, for example, in 2018. And those they were attacking, like the new governor of Wisconsin, actually represented the majority. What were the lessons they learned over 11 through 20 when these laboratories of autocracy were warming up? They learned that the attacks on voting rights could be brutally effective. that they could change the Obama coalition in a way that really damaged it in states like Ohio. And and you saw the results. I go through in the book where registration rates were way off where they targeted. When they attacked early vote and other things, it worked. They also learned that, just like with the prior slide, you never stop fighting. They never stop because they're not accountable. They can keep pushing and pushing. And even if something they doesn't work for one cycle or get struck down, pass the law again the next time, change it to account for why it was struck down, keep going and going. And they also learned, and this is the most important element of everything they do, there is no accountability for their bad behavior. Sure, some of their laws get struck down, but they have found that unless they literally are prosecuted for corruption, they never lose their own re-election from acting this way, ever. And because of that, they figured out, just keep going, keep getting more extreme. It never really matters. 2021, simply an extension. This is not because of the big lie, although that gave it some fuel and some cover. They are simply continuing to do what we saw for a decade, getting more extreme as they go. Again, what are they doing? Rigging legislative elections for the next decade. They want a second generation of people in power with no connection to democracy. They're doubling down on their voting rights attacks. In 2011, it was early vote. Now it's drop boxes. Why? Because the voters they don't like, who voted for Biden, largely voters of color, use drop boxes. So they attack that. They're stripping powers from elected officials that they see as threats. It was governors. Now it's secretaries of state. In states like Ohio, it's independent Supreme Courts because they don't want to have a check. And I'll go through the other things you all know about. They're legislating the big lie. They're stoking vigilantism, including when it comes to violence, and they're censoring history. It's not new, though. It's an extension and an acceleration of what they've done. So I'm going to pivot for a second to solutions, and I know we're going to talk a lot about this in the close, but everything I said, it sort of sums up where we are today. And this is maybe the most important slide when we think about how do we move forward. We basically have two sides in politics right now, and a group of people like yourselves figuring this out quickly. One side, the side for democracy, and that's on the left here, right? It's mostly Democrats. We still sort of assume, or have for too long, that democracy is intact. It's going to be fine. So what we do is we battle over the election results of elections to get the outcomes we want through those elections. And because that's how we view it, we generally are fighting a battle at the federal level, because that's the simplest way to get what we want, substantively. And that means we really focus on federal elections, the years of federal elections, and we especially end up focusing on swing states, because that's how we get the majorities we need in the Senate, the swing districts for the House, and ultimately Electoral College to get what we want. As I've explained here, the other side knows that their agenda and their worldview is in the minority. They know that it's unpopular. They say it. Trickle-down economics, the attacks on social issues, the sad reality that, white supremacy drives some of their behavior, and they know that in a diverse democracy that will never succeed. They know their agenda is unpopular. So unlike the people on the left side of this graph, the people on the right, their battle is over democracy itself. They're fighting a different battle. And as I've just described in all these slides, their battle, they're taking it to the part of this country that shapes democracy most directly, and that's state houses. And because they're focused in that way, they don't fight over a few swing states. They fight in all 50 states every single time there's an election that could affect democracy itself. So the point of this contrast is one side's fighting federal elections and federal years in swing states. The other side's fighting democracy all the time in all 50 states. Who's going to win? The side on the right's going to win. And that's why they're winning, for all the reasons I've gone before. What's the response? We have to reframe everything we do as we need to be leaning in that this is a battle for democracy. We see it that way, and we change everything we do. We reframe everything we do. Same or more energy, a lot of the same tactics, but the broader frame has to be, we too see it as a battle for democracy, not just federal elections to affect our outcomes in the way we want. We are battling for democracy, and that changes everything we do. And I'm going to go through this. In the book, I go through 30 steps. But it all starts with reclaiming democracy and seeing this as a battle for democracy. and I'm going to do this quickly. I might skip a few slides, but I go through 30 steps that we have to take. But I want to take one moment and say, everything I just described, this battle for democracy, is actually something that the founding fathers anticipated would be a risk. And this is lost in history. But the founding fathers, James Madison, were deeply concerned that undemocratic states would threaten the entire nation's democracy in the exact way I just described. James Madison worried that state houses were more rife for corruption and could be influenced by rich men, he said, or monarchical interests, who would then use those state houses as a vehicle to undermine our entire nation's democracy. Because of that concern, they literally wrote a clause that is often overlooked in the Constitution. Right before the clause where it says that we will protect states from foreign invasion is the very direct sentence: the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government, by which they meant government by the people, reflecting the will of the people. They basically said this is a risk, and if it looks like states are falling away from democracy, the United States itself must step up and protect democratic governance in states. I won't go through all these details, but this is something that was acted upon in the past, and there have been past moments where democracy is threatened like it is today. I'll skip this slide. There's a lot of parallels to the history that I don't have time to go through. The first of many things we have to do, and we all should take this guarantee of democracy in states seriously. All of us should. It should frame everything we do. But obviously, the United States Senate and House, and we'll talk about this in Q&A, they have to see the guarantee clause as their oath to protect democracy. They didn't a couple weeks ago. Well, they must. That is why voter protection, voting rights enforcement against corruption, federalizing the rights that are under attack in states, to me, they're all part of the guarantee clause that we should be protecting democratic governance in states. And that's why it's incumbent upon the federal government to take the step of passing these bills. And I agree with others, Cory Booker and others, Warnock and others. We cannot give up that fight. It's critical that they get that done. But the rest of us cannot wait for that action. As I said, we have to rethink everything we do so it's truly a battle for democracy. And when I say at the national level, I mean the powers that be, the parties, the committees, the funders. They need to rethink that this is the same battle for democracy the other side is fighting. And with that rethinking and reframing, everything changes in the mindset, or it should. A couple of things that are key. You define the teams differently. It's no longer about never Trump. Never Trump is too narrow. Never Trump leaves the impression that everyone who's not like Trump is for democracy. We know that's not true. We have to define it as for democracy or against. That may lead to some good alliances that we don't expect, but it also means some people who sound nice but not like Trump could also be people we're worried about when they won't support democracy. We need to play a long game for democracy. We cannot continue to play a cycle-by-cycle battle. By long game, my best example is Stacey Abrams. She knew this was a long game for democracy in Georgia. She knew that you couldn't win at every cycle. And some cycles are just not going to be good. But she kept fighting through thick and thin. And in 2018, she didn't quite win that election. It was a very tainted election. But she stood up and said, because we engaged voters and knocked on doors and registered voters, a lot more voted than ever before, we made progress. The rest of us probably looked at her and thought, well, you didn't win. What do you mean? Well, she knew that it was a long game. And she took everything she did at 18 and kept building, and she won in 20. We have to all see this as a long game, which means their strategies may be a little different. And it means the way we measure success or judge failure is different than simply looking at the result of the last cycle. We have to invest every year, everywhere. No more just swing states, 50 states, offices at every level. When positions that affect democracy are on the line, we have to fight them. We also have to challenge laws everywhere. This is when I get into much more specifics. I don't have time to go through them now, but some of the things that flow naturally out of the broader frame is a long game. In a short game, you wouldn't run a candidate in every state legislative district because you think, 60 of them are going to lose. In a long game mindset, you know that running a candidate in all 99 House districts in the state is critical because you're building and building and building. In a short game, if you only care about federal government, you won't look at the state Supreme Court races in a state. They don't seem as important. In a long game, that thinking about democracy, you realize that having a pro-democracy Supreme Court of your state may be as strong a weapon against the attacks on democracy as Congress. In a short game, you may not think about elections in an odd year as on year. In a long game where you're thinking about democracy, you do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot more to this, but these are some examples we could talk about how thinking about it as democracy in a long game, you start thinking about your strategies differently. Ohio, though, I'll just say, we had a wonderful example of playing the long game. If some of you were celebrating a couple of weeks ago when the Ohio Supreme Court struck down a gerrymandered map, know that that was the result of a decade of fighting for changing the language of the Ohio Constitution twice through voter referenda, and then flipping a 7-0 Supreme Court to be 3-3. It was a long, long, long game that we played. So even though Biden lost Ohio by 8 in 2020, I was thrilled because he was still president, and we won our Supreme Court race that year by 10. And in my long game of trying to end gerrymandering, I won in 20, even though on the surface it didn't look like it. That's a long game mindset, and it paid off handsomely so far in our fight to end gerrymandering here. Lastly, I go through in the book, and a lot of you will do these things already. I try and lay out in the book specific ways that every reader can make a difference in their own life for democracy. We often are waiting for the Stacey Abrams or Michelle Obamas to go out and do a lot of this work. I know those of you on this call aren't that way, but I try and lay out very specific ways that every single person can start building their own footprint for democracy. And only when we do that will we reach the scale we need to reach to really do what has to happen. So with that, I'll just close with John Lewis, who knew better than anybody that this is a long game we're fighting. As he lived his life, as he said till the very end, we have to each do our part.
Well, thank you. And that was tremendous.
Thank you.
I suppose my first question then is, David, what gets you up in the morning? Given that you have a story about it's worse than you think, where do you get all this energy and focus and passion, and what are your objectives in the work you're now doing?
So I'd say a couple things. One, it's sort of who I am. I even if you have a tough day, when I get up the next morning, I always find myself in a pretty positive mood. So that probably helps. But I will say, just as a sort of my own advice, is I think when you reframe it as a long game, you actually can see progress that other people don't see. And you can see hope that if you're only looking at the most short-term time frame, you really can start to see that you're making progress, because all of a sudden you're measuring it differently. And you realize every door you knock on, every new voter you register, that's progress. That's actually building towards the robust democracy we need. If we define everything only cycle to cycle, I find it to be a lot tougher. So that longer game plan, like that Supreme Court game plan we had, was a 6-year strategy. And I could see, even when we had a tough year, in 16, for example, our first 2 Supreme Court candidates under our plan, they didn't win, but they lost by a lot less than we had for 20 years. So we knew we were making progress, even if others didn't see it. 2 years later, we win both. 2 years after that, we win by 10, even when Trump wins by 8. So I have some natural optimism. I'm also scared to death of the parallels to our past that should keep us all up at night. But I also, when you set a long game framework, as you all do, you can see sort of the hope that others may not see yet. I mean, I love Stacey Abrams. Have you ever seen her look down? I did. I've known her since law. By the way, she and Rob and I were all law school together. Clearly, I didn't go to the same classes they did. They took some special ones. Stacey's always positive, and I think it's because she's always been measuring her work against a very long sort of set of measurements about democracy. And not only is Georgia blue this moment.
So can I ask a question that Gerald raised about education and the need to really understand where we are and understand history? Gerald is, in fact, describes himself as a Dakota farm kid, a Vietnam vet, a world traveler, and asks, how have we become this disconnected from reality? And in your book, you talk about how we really need to study our own history, because Madison was concerned, and as you briefly mentioned, and maybe can build on, we've seen this before. This isn't new.
Yeah, I didn't have time to go through it, but the parallels to how the Reconstruction moved into Jim Crow are as scary as can be. And by the way, for all those who are on Twitter, I'm on Twitter. I'll give my address here. I do whiteboards every couple of days. I started doing them a few months ago, and people really watch them. And I have a whiteboard that has been shared 350,000, viewed 350,000 times. And it walks through how, through a series of steps, so African Americans voting in big numbers in the 1870s, more registered Black voters in Louisiana in the 1870s than white voters. And they were electing Black elected officials, speakers of the houses, state legislators, mayors. People don't know this. We assume that it was a robust, diverse democracy. But the forces of white supremacy didn't like it. And there's always a backlash, just like after Obama won. What did they do? They said they were all voting fraudulently. Then they attacked them through all sorts of ways, sadly, a lot of violence too. When they could, they started changing the way you register, wiping these folks off the rolls. Then the Supreme Court at the time said it was all okay. The federal government could have acted and then didn't. And it led to Jim Crow for 70 years, or more. Generations went by never being able to recover from the loss of democracy that was happening in plain sight. And so one of the scariest parts about this current attack on history is I believe it's an attack on us learning the lessons and the deep parallels between the worst moments of our history that are sadly so similar to now. Joe Biden said that was Jim Crow 2.0 a couple weeks ago, and people started attacking him. We all need to know our history well enough to say that's absolutely correct. He's absolutely right. And one other parallel, a couple weeks ago when when the Republicans were attacking the new voting rights bills, what'd they say? It's a federal takeover. As I put in the slide, the guarantee clause was saying if democracy is under attack in states, federal government, get in there. It's in the Constitution. So the language federal takeover not only is ignorant of the 14th and 15th Amendments and the guarantee clause, it also is just denying our Constitution more generally. But what is it? It's the playbook from the 60s segregationists when they learned they could no longer be openly racist to attack voting rights laws. What did they say? It's a federal takeover. The parallels between some of our darkest moments are staring us in the face. And I think the worries about the attack on broad education about our history are, to Gerald's point, sort of an effort to dumb us down so we don't recognize clear warning signals that we should be recognizing.
So many people, we heard from Twana, Alice, Arthur, and many are asking here, what do we do? And let's start at the federal level.
Right.
And so, Arthur talked about, can we change the Electoral Count Act? You've talked about John Lewis and Freedom to Vote Acts. What are the priority areas and how do we apply intense pressure on our current federal officials? Because as you said, it's not all going to happen somewhere else. Some of it's got to happen up there in the Capitol, and we cannot afford to give up.
Yeah, and let me be very clear. We all have to do work. We can't wait for the Senate. But it's not good enough when I hear some Democrats say, well, we're going to go out organize them back at the state level. At some point, the laws, and if you read the book, and by the way, this is going to sound really shameless self-promotion, but if you're interested in what I just said and presented, please read the book. It goes through a lot more detail on all this. And I wrote it so people would read it. So I'm going to push it. The federal government must act. The rest of us can do a lot. But the reason the founders said the United States shall guarantee is because they knew against relentless attacks on democracy at the state level, the federal government is the strongest pushback. And without it, I greatly worry that all the other work, frankly, may not matter. And I don't want to ever have us not work, but we can't let them off the hook. And I know they had a vote a couple weeks ago. They cannot stop. And the Electoral Count Act is important, but let me just be very clear. It's a sliver of the problem. Here's my fear about the Electoral Count Act. What are Republicans saying? Oh, it's a federal takeover. We can't address these things in the states. All the Electoral Count Act is doing is impacting one election for president in the way those votes are counted, the electoral votes are counted. If all they do is fix that, I guarantee what we're going to hear from the Republicans is, oh, we just fixed the problem and we didn't deal with the states that we can't be taking over. It will literally put out there a narrative as if what's happening in states is okay. And it'd be as if in 1965, when the momentum was building, the Southern Democrats, I'm sorry they were the Democrats then, said publicly, listen, okay, we understand. We don't need to change anything we're doing in our states, poll taxes and all these attacks on voters. But if we fix the outcome of how, after our states are counted, after all those bad elections, we count up the total points differently, we'll fix that part. Everyone would have said, no, the problem is in the states. And the worry about the Electoral Count Act and nothing else is it gives Mitch McConnell the narrative that they fixed it by only fixing a sliver of the federal problem and not going to the heart of the problem, which they've known for 30 years, which we haven't seen, which is democracy is drawn up in these states more than anywhere else. So Freedom to Vote Act, John Lewis Act, enforcement of those acts, I believe so much of the attack on democracy is through substance, like attacking women's right to choose. So federalizing those rights as much as we can, no longer taking them for granted in these undemocratic places, all of that is critical. Now, the details of these laws are very good. They go through, some baseline guarantees on voting, but they also deal with gerrymandering. They would create rules around gerrymandering to stop the worst of it. There's a lot of good in there. And it's not, we have to keep on these people to keep going. I'm a little more aggressive than I think the senators are. I believe if Chuck Grassley has to stay up every night for a week and Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley to argue for these things, make them do it. Don't call a vote and walk away as if this is normal. One of the biggest mistakes those for democracy make, not you, and I assume you'll see, not me, we cannot treat it as politics as normal. Because when we do, it leaves the impression it must not be that big a deal. When Joe Biden said, and I love Joe Biden, but when he said a month ago in Atlanta or weeks ago, I've been silent for too long and no more, I said, you should have never been silent. Because the minute you're silent on this stuff, it leaves the impression that it must be okay, or you wouldn't be silent. So we have to, whether it's the U.S. senators or everyone else, start acting and talking as if our democracy is on the line, because it is. And that's a much higher level of ratcheted up activity than I think what we saw all last year. So all that stuff has to happen.
And the volunteers here, we're going to go out and elect and work to elect a number of these people, particularly in the Senate on this cycle. Many of us here worked for Kirsten Sinema a few years back. We need to apply pressure on the people we're working for that this is the most critical thing.
Absolutely. By the way, Senator Padilla has been amazing. He is on it with the filibuster. I think he's been a real shining light. I sent him one of the articles I've written about all this stuff.
Great. Well, we in California try and do our bit. And let's talk about the states. 82% of our audience here today are from California, plus others, and welcome from some 20 states, including New York, New Jersey, and many blue states. But we are none in the most desperate states. And therefore, one of our strategies at DVC is to work closely with partners who are working in those states, which have included Sister District and the registration efforts of Field Team 6 and Reclaim Our Votes. From your practical party experience being on the ground in Ohio, what do you look for from outside supporters? What's most important? How can we help?
So as I was chair, I used to always say we are strong advocates of political tourism in Ohio. By the way, this organization, and I've told you this DVC and the affiliate groups are so impressive. You are running something that I think would compete with almost any state party in the country for how organized and impressive what you're doing is. What you can do in other states is enormous. These efforts, and there are more coming, and I am kind of doing my own effort to get my hands around the best of them. But whether it's adopting districts, whether it's a group called the States Project, which it partners up with a bunch of donors from one place like California, will come together, and then they will support 6 or 7 candidates in a swing state in a state house. All that work is so important. Some people are doing a lot of postcards. If you're giving money, all of the ways, and my only advice would be the more you're doing that's directly helping the candidates on the ground or organizations that are on the ground that are registering people, et cetera, the better. Sometimes things get a little complex, and I think, hold on, I'm trying to get this light on here. Some things can get a little more complex, and that might lead to wasteful money. The things that you put money into that can directly go right to candidates and right to organizations is the best thing I would recommend. And like Sister District, there's the States Project and others, and I'm happy to connect you to all those groups. So my sense is a lot of you are already involved in them. All that helps enormously. And by the way, if you are a lawyer and you want to go to a state at the end of election for voter protection, great. If you want to knock on doors and make phone calls, great. We really need all that and then some.
So with a nod to questions from John and particularly Elizabeth, who argues this strongly, what should we expect and what is happening with the Democratic Party itself? The failure of sustained integrated action across all states over the past 2 decades is in many ways a failure of the party. Do you think this is changing? And how can we help incentivize and support such changes in the party?
I think the party has figured it out. So when I first became chair, which was 15, I could not have told you what the Democratic Party did in states, except come to our states and raise money from our donors and move that money somewhere else. Tom Perez actually did a lot of improvement. One of my first text messages when we won that Supreme Court case, striking down those districts, was to Tom Perez saying thank you, because they did focus on the Supreme Court races over several cycles. They listened to us. They helped us. Jamie Harrison is a good friend. He's the former chair of the South Carolina Democratic Party. So he understands what being overlooked as a red state looks like. The question is, though, beyond just the party, the party is a creature of everyone who gives to it, of the White House, of all the committees, the federal committees. There's got to be a broader collective decision that we have to broaden this battle to be about democracy. And as I watch, I don't think it's there yet. And Jamie Harrison, he's retweeting me all the, he's got my book, he's mentioned in it. It's got to be a collective decision by just the other side did it. I put in my book, if we took a percentage, single digit of all the money we put in the presidential cycle and spread it out over 4 years and invested it in 50 states, in local districts, that it would make a huge difference. And I'm not talking about a big percentage of it. I'm talking about a single digit. And my guess is some people would look at me like, who would ever do that? That's crazy. And my answer is, well, the Koch brothers would do it. They did it. Look, it worked. And we have to make that same collective decision. I think, by the way, knowing that we are generation behind of what they're doing. Someone mentioned earlier, Eric Holder understands this. Eric Holder was a big part of our effort to change our court as well as to change our constitution. He's in court helping us fight the battle. So there are key pieces that are doing it, but it can't be set one-off programs like it is. It's got to be the whole picture. It's a battle for democracy. We all see it that way. We strategize that way. We fight that way. And it's getting there, but we're way behind. And this is why I wrote this book. I mean, I've written a few novels, as someone mentioned. I wasn't going to write a book this year, but come April, I'm watching all this thinking, my God, it's happening in front of our eyes. No one is saying it in the way that it needs to be said. So I decided I'll just do it myself and get it out there. So we all have to just start spreading the word like you're doing.
I think you were trying to write the most exciting novel you could, and it just unfortunately turned out to be nonfiction.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of my fiction has come true, and I wish my nonfiction was fiction.
Would cease to be true. It's the midterms now, and we're all simultaneously worrying about 2024 and what's Trump going to do. So the shiny bauble is back, and we're going to fixate again on, can we keep the House? What's happening with the Senate? What did Trump or the Congressional QAnon caucus just say? The big lie. Can you give us all individually some therapy on how we need to refocus ourselves this cycle on truly caring enough about individual states? I mean,
I just think I would honestly say, to the extent I understand what you're doing, I think doing what you're doing, everyone involved, continuing to do it. And we have to go beyond, although we need to, I want to win the Senate race in Ohio. Tim Ryan can win. So help us win that. But go beyond the Senate and the House. we've got in ourselves to go beyond that. We have shown that when we really care about something, we'll give a candidate in Kentucky $100 million to beat Mitch McConnell in a race we could never win, right? I mean, we've shown that we know how to get that energy. My point would be, take that energy and apply it to a more democratic democratic battle strategy. And that means beyond those federal seats, beyond watching Trump speeches and getting worked up, really focus. And all of you on this call, and again, I put my email up there. I'll talk to any group you want me to talk to, any state. I do it almost every day. But all of you could play a role in state house races. If you're in a state like Ohio or Georgia, think about all the things you can do in your life to register voters, because they're under. I go through in painful detail in the book how brutal the purging of voters is in states like Ohio. It's so much worse than people can see. It is impacting outcomes. It crushed Hillary Clinton's campaign almost before it started. There were so many fewer voters in the most important county, Cleveland. And so there's a lot everyone here can do to lift democracy besides helping candidates. Never let a state house seat, if you're in a red state or red district, don't ever let any state house seat go unchallenged. It's a gift that keeps on giving when we let them have 30 seats out of 99 without even a challenge, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So help the federal candidates that are strategic, but don't simply stop there, which is kind of what a lot of people have been doing, getting very excited on the federal battle, but then forgetting that the battle for democracy is much broader and much deeper. Can I address Pat's question here, Pat Krakoff? So a really, 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 really important point of my book. Nothing I am saying almost to you is how I would run for office, to Pat's point. Everything I'm saying is too red hot, right? It's pretty partisan. It's pretty alarming. To Pat's point, almost every aspect, almost endemic to what I've described, undemocratic state houses, are failed public outcomes. Schools collapsing, schools 4 days a week in Kansas, an energy grid collapsing in Texas so people froze to death, roads falling apart in Michigan, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm talking to you all to get us fired up to make this fight, but it doesn't mean everything I'm saying is the message. The message when we've won is the message about the public outcomes that everyday people care about, who aren't as partisan and fired up as we are, who simply want a good school system, their small town to stop falling apart, a working energy system, and good roads. So what I would recommend in every state, candidates do, wherever, at whatever level, is identify the public outcomes that I guarantee you are collapsing because their state house is no longer democracy. And that's how I'd run for office. So this is sort of my internal coach discussion. This is what's happening. We got to go fix it. But to the broader world, we have to be a lot smarter as Democrats to focus on the outcomes. In Ohio, I would say that's on small towns falling apart. That's on schools falling apart. There's a Democratic governor in Kansas right now. Why? Because she said it was outrageous that their schools were 4 days a week. It didn't feel partisan. Everyone agreed it was outrageous. Beto O'Rourke is running on the energy grid falling apart, leading to people freezing to death. That's how you convert the corrosion. One of my slides said, focus on the corrosion more than the corruption. The corrosion of public outcomes is how I think we win back seats in a lot of these places.
And let me build on that. What do you see happening and what needs to happen with messaging, right? I mean, what you're saying is the messaging can't be theoretical. It's got to be practical, in the street, things that matter to people. There's the feeling that, we're getting out-messaged by the Republicans, that perhaps the Democratic Party doesn't have the best messaging. Where are we in the state of messaging, and what do we need to do? And I think you partly answered that by saying, make it make sense to the individual.
We still haven't been as good as this as we need to. And I think we are not, we are not, first of all, there isn't, I saw this as a Democratic chair. There isn't a broader universal effort to do message best practice among candidates. It's like herding cats. I tried to do that as a chair and give every single candidate, here are the ingredients of good message. Many of them actually did go with that. But as a country, as Democrats, let's just talk about the party for a second, although the pro-democracy movement needs to go way beyond just Democrats. I think the party and others need to play a bigger role. And here's the good news. The things that we fight for are generally, and this is the whole point of this battle, they're generally the popular things. People want to deal with climate change. They want common sense gun laws. They're for Roe v. Wade. They want a middle-class based economy. Trickle down is terribly unpopular. But we have to figure out how to message all that in a way that people see it for what it is, and we don't get drawn off in all these crazy debates. And the good news is the full agenda hasn't happened yet. But even in the infrastructure bill, there's a lot of great messaging that could be done. If Build Back Better passes, there's even more messaging on things that actually help people. But then we have to be smart enough to translate the substance of those policies into real messaging. And the thing that I would really do if I were, if you gave me the power for a day, I'd say to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg, and some of them are doing this, let's be clear. It's not just the message, it's where and how you deliver it. It's not just set speeches behind a podium to 500 people or on TV. I would go to the very places that are struggling because of this broken state house government in state for state. I'd go to this small town, and before I gave that speech, and I totally agree with George Lakoff, by the way, I put that in the book, everyone should read him. I'd go to the small town, I'd walk that street. And I put one of these towns in my book. It's called Manchester. No sentient human being could walk the street of Manchester, Ohio, and not be outraged by its condition. And I'd go to those towns, and I'd have cameras with me, and I'd say, this is what we're talking about, and this is what we're going to fix. And I'm Joe Biden from Scranton, Pennsylvania, so I get it. And I would be much more sort of on the ground instead of only behind the podium speeches. And I would be talking about the improvement of these public outcomes every single day. And by the way, what I love about that too is the public outcome needs are the same in big blue areas as they are in rural areas. There's no need to hyper target this message because the small towns need good roads and infrastructure and healthcare to deal, especially with an opioid crisis. It's still on fire there, just like bigger cities do.
So we should really dig into, the message so far is we passed the infrastructure bill, and the message we're going to tell people is we passed the infrastructure bill, but that means nothing. We owe it to all of ourselves to go dig into it, find out, well, what bridge did get fixed? What road did get fixed?
And worse than that, these small towns like the ones in my book, Manchester, when they hear, they're mostly Republican, let's be honest. When they hear Democrats say we passed that bill, they assume it's not for them. They just assume it, which isn't a crazy thing to assume. Donald Trump kind of thought that way. We have to go right to those places and say, this isn't just for the big bridge in Cincinnati that everyone talks about. This is for your bridge too and your road. Now, it needs to be real, but this is for your place too. And that's why I love that Joe Biden should say in the State of the Union, just so everyone knows, I'm not just talking about the city of Cincinnati, which needs help. I'm talking about the small town. Call it the small town turnaround and say, I'm from Scranton, so I've seen it, and we know you need help, and you've been let down by the very people you've been electing. I think you need to be very explicit to these places because they will otherwise assume it's for somewhere else, and they'll just keep voting the way they've been voting.
So taking some questions that were about social media from Ariel and Eric, I want to sort of generalize it to how do we communicate with these places? Now, as remote volunteers, we're canvassing, phone banking, text banking, postcarding, social media are all options. Talk about what you think needs to happen, in the town of Manchester.
Anything you can do to help. The best thing we could do is get candidates in every district who are from these towns to carry the message. And then all the rest of us get them enough help so they have the resources to carry the message. And right now, we are doing both of these things poorly in too many places. One, we're not challenging. Now, we did a better job in Ohio the last couple of years, but in many of these states, and again, short game, you don't do it because you don't think it matters. Long game, it's everything. Nothing could be more important to Stacey Abrams than a good state house candidate in every district of Georgia. Nothing, because it would lift turnout everywhere and carry message everywhere. So we need to make sure we're challenging in every district, and that's not on you. But once we do that, and there are mechanisms I'm working on that I'll share with you down the road, then we need to make sure these candidates who are the local person, the well-known person, whoever they are, they need to have enough resources that they can carry that message. And I'll just give an example of this at the local level. when I was chair of Ohio Party, we were really into local races, not state house, but local mayor's races, city council races. There were 4 different towns that we ran hard in 19 that Trump had won 60-40 or better, that we won 60-40 or better and knocked out an incumbent. We had a 24-year-old Democrat win in a town called Ironton on the river, and 3 others. Why? Because they said the town's not doing very well. We're the only different vision on the entire ballot. Vote for us, and they all won by 60-40. So we need the candidates in the game, and then everyone else from wherever they can get the support. We need to help lift them, and if that's direct support through giving, whether it's postcards, whatever it is, the more we can lift those good local voices, the better. And that's why we have to field everywhere and broaden our spend. So, if you've got 40 people running for a state house, but those 40 don't have any money, they're not really a campaign, and they'll never carry the message. If they've got resources, they will not only carry the message that helps every candidate on the ballot, we also know from data they will lift turnout.
We're now at time for our 75 minutes, so we're running over. Thank you all for still being here. I want to ask as a final question, you quote John Lewis, freedom is the continuous action we must all take. It is not some plateau where we can sit down and rest. So talk to us a bit about the attitudes, the stamina and practices we need to work in the long game. I think sometimes that we were sort of blinded by the Obama years. And I think that for myself, I remember standing in a parking lot in 2008 as we closed down a precinct office with tears running down my face as the results came in. I thought we'd reached a plateau, and I was wrong. 2 years later, the attack on the states in 2010 and dramatically accelerated the gerrymandering while we slept. So how can we all get our heads into the long game? Help me understand. How do I need to act?
I mean, I'd buy the book. It walks through all the things that you can do. And then I think, again, measure your own activity as part of the long game. And don't get too excited if we're winning the short game, although it's great to win the Obama White House. It's great to win the House in 18. But if we decide, like we all did, and we're all guilty of it, when we won that because we are defining the game too narrowly, we said, we did it. We're done. And in a moment, we actually did that after the Biden win, too. We win the House. We won Warnock and Ossoff. If it's all over, if the battle's for democracy and you saw that we lost almost every state house we need to win in 20, then you knew the battle wasn't over. And just like when you lose, but you're going to lose. This midterm may be tough, by the way. One thing I would tell everyone, don't give up, although it's going to be tough. If we don't do well in this midterm, we don't normally do well in presidential midterms, when we have the presidency. This is a link to my book, by the way. Don't give up all hope as long as there's a longer term plan we're all doing, and we're still working in December and January and on for that long game. I mean, so that would be my advice. Here's the other thing I'd say, and I said it earlier, but I want to say it again, because to me, it's kind of what inspires me. Every one of us has a footprint in this world of influence. And too often, I think we don't think about how broad that footprint can be if we really used it. And it depends on where you are. And a lot of you in California, your best footprint is through organizations like this, Help Elsewhere. But wherever you are, you can make a difference pushing for democracy every single day if you've thought through, how do you add it to your own personal mission statement? Mine was, hey, I know how to write books. I'm going to write another one that I didn't even plan on writing. Another may be, you're on the board of a food bank. Ask the board members, are we registering every single customer at our food bank? We know they're under attack by purging. We know many of them don't vote. Are we registering them? That's your footprint. Think through every aspect. If you know a mayor in any state, are they using every public-facing service that they provide to lift democracy? I didn't when I was on city council. I didn't think about it. But every rec center, every health clinic, every public transportation depot could be registering voters. Now, you obviously look at the laws of each state. Are they? Most, my guesses, are not. So if you know the mayor, ask him or ask her. Are you using your mayor's office to lift democracy, knowing in many of these states, your citizens are being attacked every day because they're going to vote for the other side? So the thing I would do beyond sort of the specifics and everything your program does, don't wait for the cure-all program or the outside effort to register people. What is everything you can do in your footprint? You run a small business, you run a restaurant. Do you do this for your customers? If everyone starts to do that, and that's why I'm so sort of passionate about getting my book out there, and if others are saying the same thing, wonderful, that's how we hit a scale where it starts to move the needle. You know, BMV, Bureau of Motor Vehicles, great. I'm glad we register there. That's some group of people. But there's no reason that we aren't registering people and engaging voters in every type of service that's provided out there. If the people in charge of them care about democracy, they could all make slight adjustments to what they do. Again, someone comes to a health clinic. At the end of the interview, oh, by the way, have you moved lately? Okay. Have you registered to vote? Okay. Here are your papers. Like we could be doing all that all the time. And my guess is most don't do it because they don't think about it in that way. That's the other way. I would just every single day get involved.
Long game, always on the field. Keep moving.
Absolutely.
David, I want to thank you on behalf of our community here. I want to thank you on behalf of our democracy for your work and for your passion here today. This recording will be made available. So thank you, and thank you for your offer to everybody here. If you have groups, if you want to hear more about this, if you want to ask different questions and quiz David, invite him. He was very gracious in coming to talk to us, and I've seen him talking to any number of groups. Watching you on various groups, David, made me think I was seeing the Don't Look Up movie, which would be Don't Look Down to the States. I think you would have done a better job than Leonardo DiCaprio, so I'm sure your movie career in the movie of democracy is underway.
Yeah, that movie did scare me. It did feel similar. Thank you for what you're doing. It's incredible what you're doing. I love the model. I love that you're getting people from all over the country fired up and that you're helping people all over. Makes a huge difference.
So I want to conclude here by telling people things that they can do. So next steps. Obviously, the DVC wants to be able to help you in 2022. If you feel so inclined, please donate. And you can do that by going to our site. More importantly, for everybody who works with the DVC, keep track of our calendar of events, right? You're going to see more and more events pile up, including our partner events. So please take a look at that. And I particularly want to highlight the 3 partners we've been working with over the past year who are very relevant to what we've been talking about. So sisterdistrict.com, fieldteam6.org, Reclaim Our Vote. These are organizations working in the states, and I'm going to do a small live demo of how to think about them. So this is demvolctr.org, or just look up Democratic Volunteer Center Silicon Valley. This is the site, and if you click through into events, you'll get the calendar, and you'll be able to see what we're doing. And if you click on donate, you can come and press a button here and donate some money. Similarly, you can follow the link and find out about Reclaim Our Vote. And on Reclaim Our Vote, you can click donate and donate there. This is Field Team 6 that's working in a variety of states to lead voter drives, and we are working to support them. So click on the donate button, and then you'll see a donate button. So click. There we go. I just donated $50. One should always add a tip. And boom, we have donated to Field Team 6 through Act Blue. Very simple. Similarly, if you have not looked at sisterdistrict.com and you want data, you want to know where it matters, what counts, you owe it to yourself to go to sisterdistrict.com, the Sister District Project, and take a look at this. And you will find their impact report, which is great. You will find more research than you know what to do with on this site. I am a huge fan of Sister District. And when you're there, if you want to support them, go to the donate button. Here's the donate button. Press a button, right? So here you are. I will donate $500 to Sister District right now. And I ask you to go donate $500 to Sister District. And if we were to all do that, that would actually make a big difference in the states. Sister District targets right down to the state representative, the assembly representative in this state where it's going to make a difference. So to answer your questions, places where you can find information about where does it matter, where can we make a difference, where are they fighting, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, Reclaim Our Vote is related to the Center for Common Ground, absolutely correct. And it's also part of the a larger organization, but the initiative that we're supporting is called Reclaim Our Vote. These are the sites. It's sisterdistrict.com, it's buildteam6.org, and you have to do a bit of a search for Reclaim Our Vote and the Center for Common Ground, but you'll find them if you just search for it, and follow our calendar. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for all the work we're going to do together in 2022. And thank you, David Pepper, for coming to talk to us and firing us up.